On July 16th, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the first nuclear weapon in human history detonated in the desert of New Mexico. The light was visible from 3 states. The shockwave knocked men off their feet from 6 miles away. The temperature at the point of detonation was 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who had led the project that built the bomb, watched from a bunker in the desert. And as the fireball rose into the sky, as the shockwave hit him and the light flooded the desert and the world changed forever in a single instant, a line of ancient Sanskrit came into his mind. He did not say it in that moment. He stood in silence, watching. But years later, in a television interview that has been watched by millions of people, he described what had passed through his mind. We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That line has been quoted thousands of times since Oppenheimer spoke it. It appears in films, in books, in political speeches, in science journalism, in every retrospective on the nuclear age. It has become one of the most famous utterances in modern history. A moment of terrible poetry, a genius confronting the enormity of what he had done, reaching for ancient words to describe a modern horror. But here is what almost no one who quotes that line has ever explained. That is not what the verse means. The translation Oppenheimer used, destroyer of worlds, is accurate as far as it goes. But in its original Sanskrit context, in the philosophical framework of the Bhagavad Gita, the verse is not about destruction. It is not a statement of horror or guilt or apocalyptic power. It is a statement about the nature of reality itself, about the nature of time, about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between the individual human being and the infinite ground of existence from which all things, including creation, including destruction, including the bomb and the desert and the man watching from the bunker, arise and return. Oppenheimer had studied Sanskrit. He read the Bhagavad Gita in the original language. He understood, at least partially, the philosophical depth of the text he was quoting. And in his final years, in the years after the bomb, after the security hearings that stripped him of his clearance, after the public humiliation that ended his official career, he returned again and again to the questions that the Gita had been asking for 3,000 years. Questions about the nature of the observer and the observed, about the relationship between consciousness and matter, about what it means to act in a world where action has consequences that no individual can fully foresee or control, about the nature of the field, the invisible underlying reality, from which the visible world of particles and waves and explosions and human choices emerges. These are not only philosophical questions. In the last decades of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st, they have become scientific questions. Questions that the physics Oppenheimer helped build is now being forced to confront, whether it wants to or not. And the ancient tradition that Oppenheimer quoted in the desert of New Mexico had been answering them for 3,000 years. This is the story of what Oppenheimer actually understood, what the Bhagavad Gita was actually saying. And what modern physics, the science that gave us quantum mechanics and the bomb and the most precise description of physical reality in human history, is beginning to rediscover in the language of mathematics and experiment. The answer begins with a single Sanskrit word, Brahman. To understand what Oppenheimer understood, we have to go back to the text. Not to the famous line, not to the moment of destruction, but to the conversation that contains it. A conversation that the Vedic tradition considers one of the most important philosophical exchanges in the entire history of human thought. The Bhagavad Gita is a dialogue. It takes place on a battlefield at the moment before a great war is about to begin. On one side stands an army, on the other side stands another army, and in the centre, in a chariot between the two forces, stands a warrior prince named Arjuna, frozen, unable to move, overwhelmed by what he is about to do. Because on the other side of the battlefield, among the enemy soldiers, Arjuna can see his cousins, his teachers, men he has known and loved his entire life. And he cannot bring himself to raise his bow against them. He drops his weapons. He tells his charioteer that he will not fight, that no victory is worth the destruction of the people he loves. His charioteer is Krishna, the divine in human form. And Krishna's response to Arjuna's paralysis is the content of the Bhagavad Gita. 18 chapters of philosophy, delivered on a battlefield, in the space between two armies, in the moment before everything changes. What Krishna tells Arjuna is not what a modern Western reader might expect. He does not tell Arjuna to suppress his grief or harden his heart. He does not tell him that war is good, or that the deaths of his cousins do not matter. He tells him something far more radical, something that cuts through the entire framework of ordinary human perception and replaces it with a vision of reality so different from our everyday assumptions that once understood, it changes everything. Krishna tells Arjuna, "You are not who you think you are, and neither are the men across the battlefield." What Arjuna sees, what all of us see when we look at the world, is a surface, a display of individual forms, individual bodies, individual personalities, individual stories, distinct, separate, mortal, born and dying, coming into existence and passing out of it. This is the world of what the Vedic tradition calls Maya, the field of appearances, the play of forms, the visible surface of reality. But beneath that surface, beneath every individual form, every particle, every wave, every body, every mind, there is a single reality, undivided, infinite, eternal, neither created nor destroyed, the ground of all being, the consciousness in which the entire display of the visible world arises, like a dream arises in the mind of the dreamer. The Vedic tradition calls this reality Brahman, and Krishna's central teaching, the teaching that gives the verse about death its true meaning, is this: the Atman, the individual self, the innermost consciousness that each person experiences as I, is not separate from Brahman. It is Brahman. The individual soul and the universal ground are, at the deepest level, identical. This is the doctrine of Advaita, non-duality, the teaching that the apparent separation between the individual and the whole, between the self and the universe, between the observer and the observed, is not ultimate reality. It is the appearance that Maya, the veil of ordinary perception, places over a more fundamental unity. Now return to the verse that Oppenheimer quoted. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In the original context, Krishna is revealing his true nature to Arjuna, lifting the veil of Maya, showing Arjuna what lies beneath the human face of the charioteer. And what Arjuna sees is not a person, not an individual, not a form with a biography and a name. He sees Brahman itself, the infinite ground of being, in which creation and destruction, birth and death, the arising and passing of all forms are simply the rhythm of the one reality expressing itself through time. I am become death does not mean I am a destroyer. It means I am the totality. I am the ground in which all forms arise and to which all forms return. I am what was before the beginning and what will remain after the end. I am the field in which the bomb and the desert and the man watching and the men who will die are all, at the deepest level, one thing. Oppenheimer quoted that verse in the desert because in the moment of the detonation, something in him recognized it, recognized the totality, recognized that he had, in a single instant, crossed a threshold, that the force he had unleashed was not simply a larger explosion. It was a confrontation with the ground of being itself, with the level of reality where creation and destruction are the same act. He had read the Gita. He understood in his bones what Krishna was describing. And in the moment that the bomb went off, he recognized it. Not as poetry, not as metaphor, but as physics. The fact that Oppenheimer read Sanskrit is not widely known. It is mentioned in biographies, documented in letters, confirmed by colleagues, but it has never made it into the popular mythology of the man. The popular mythology is about the bomb, about Los Alamos, about the security hearing, about the tragedy of a brilliant man broken by the system he had served. But the inner life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the philosophical and spiritual framework through which he understood what he was doing and what it meant, was shaped more than almost anything else by the ancient Indian tradition he had studied since his 20s. He began learning Sanskrit in 1933. While he was a professor at Berkeley, he found a Sanskrit teacher, Arthur Ryder, and studied with him for years. He read the Bhagavad Gita in the original. He read the Upanishads, the ancient philosophical texts that form the intellectual foundation of the Vedic tradition. The texts in which the doctrine of Brahman and Atman is developed with extraordinary philosophical precision. He gave copies of the Gita to friends. He recommended it to students. He returned to it throughout his life. This was not a casual interest. This was a man who was grappling at the deepest level of his intelligence with questions that Western science in the early 20th century was raising but not answering. Questions about the nature of the observer, about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, about what it means to say that something exists. Because quantum mechanics, the theoretical framework that Oppenheimer helped develop, that describes the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales, had created a profound philosophical crisis. A crisis that its founders recognized immediately and that mainstream physics has been trying to look away from ever since. The crisis is this: quantum mechanics, in its standard mathematical formulation, describes the physical world not as a collection of objects with definite properties, but as a field of probabilities. A quantum system does not have a definite position, a definite momentum, a definite state of any kind, until it is observed, until a measurement is made. until something that the mathematics calls the observer interacts with the system and collapses the wave function, the field of probabilities, into a single definite outcome. The observer, the act of observation, consciousness interacting with physical reality and determining through that interaction what reality actually is. This is not a philosophical add-on to quantum mechanics. It is built into the mathematics. The equations do not make sense without it. The most successful physical theory in human history, the theory that underlies every semiconductor, every laser, every MRI machine, every piece of modern technology, cannot be fully interpreted without confronting the role of the observer. And the ancient Indian tradition that Oppenheimer had been studying since his 20s had been exploring exactly this question for 3,000 years. The Upanishads describe reality as fundamentally conscious, not as matter that at some level of complexity gives rise to consciousness, but as consciousness itself, which through the play of Maya, through the veil of ordinary perception, appears as matter. Brahman, the universal consciousness, the ground of being, is not something that exists in the world. It is what the world exists in. It is the field in which the observer and the observed, the wave function and the measurement, the physicist and the bomb, arise together as aspects of a single undivided reality. Oppenheimer knew this. He had read it. He had studied it in the original Sanskrit. And as he spent his career developing the physics that would eventually force these questions into the open, as he watched quantum mechanics mature into the most precise and powerful theory in scientific history, while still carrying at its heart an unresolved philosophical mystery, he knew that the ancient tradition he had studied in his 20s was not mythology. It was a description of something real, something that Western physics was being forced by its own mathematics to rediscover. In 1927, at the Solvay conference in Brussels, the greatest gathering of physicists in history sat down to discuss the implications of quantum mechanics. Einstein was there, Bohr was there, Heisenberg was there, Schrödinger was there, Planck was there. Together, they represented more Nobel Prizes than had ever been assembled in a single room. And they could not agree on what their own equations meant. The mathematics of quantum mechanics worked. It worked with a precision that no physical theory had ever achieved before. It predicted experimental results to extraordinary decimal places. It described the behavior of electrons, photons, and atoms with accuracy so fine that it remains, nearly a century later, unchallenged as the most precisely verified theory in the history of science. But what did it mean? The wave function, the mathematical object that describes a quantum system, does not describe a thing with definite properties. It describes a superposition of possibilities. An electron before measurement is not in any particular place. It is, in some sense, that the mathematics insist upon, but ordinary language struggles to express, in all possible places at once, each with a different probability. It is only when a measurement is made, only when an observer interacts with the system, that the superposition collapses and a single definite result appears. Einstein hated this. He spent the last 30 years of his life trying to prove that quantum mechanics was incomplete, that the probabilities described by the wave function reflected our ignorance of some deeper deterministic reality, not the fundamental nature of the physical world itself. He famously said that God does not play dice with the universe. But the experiments kept confirming the quantum mechanical predictions, and the philosophical crisis kept deepening. Because if the wave function collapses upon measurement, upon observation, then what counts as an observer? Does the observer have to be conscious? Does a measuring instrument collapse a wave function? Does a tree falling in an unobserved forest have a definite location? These are not poetic questions. They are questions that the mathematics of quantum mechanics forces upon anyone who takes the theory seriously. The Copenhagen interpretation, the official consensus position developed by Bohr and Heisenberg, essentially said, stop asking. The wave function is a tool for predicting measurement outcomes. It does not describe reality as it is between measurements. The question of what the electron is doing before you look at it is not a scientific question. Oppenheimer, deeply trained in both quantum mechanics and the Vedic philosophical tradition, was not satisfied with that answer because he recognized the structure of the problem. The Vedic tradition had been asking the same question for 3,000 years in a different language, not what is the electron doing before you look at it, but what is the world before consciousness arises in it? What is the ground of being before the observer and the observed separate? What is Brahman before Maya, before the veil of ordinary perception divides the one into the many? And the Vedic answer, developed with extraordinary philosophical precision in the Upanishads, systematized by the philosopher Adi Shankaracharya in the 8th century, and explored in every subsequent generation of the Indian philosophical tradition, was not stop asking. It was, this is the most important question there is. And the answer requires not just thinking, but direct investigation. Not just theory, but practice. Not just philosophy, but the transformation of the instrument of knowing, consciousness itself. Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory, said it directly. He said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Consciousness as fundamental, matter as derivative. The observer not as an add-on to physical reality, but as its ground. This is, word for word, the central claim of the Vedic tradition. The claim that Oppenheimer had been studying since his 20s. The claim that the mathematics of quantum mechanics was forcing physics to confront whether it wanted to or not. He was not the only physicist who saw it, but he was one of the few who had the philosophical training and the ancient texts to understand what it meant. Here is what the Upanishads say about Brahman, not in theological terms, not as a statement of faith, but as a philosophical description of the structure of reality, a description that, when placed next to the language of modern physics, produces a correspondence so precise that it is difficult to explain as coincidence. Brahman, in the Upanishadic teaching, is described as Sat Chit Ananda, 3 Sanskrit words, 3 aspects of a single reality. Sat means being, pure existence, the ground that simply is, not this or that, not here or there, not at this moment or that moment, but the condition of existence itself, prior to all particular forms, the isness that underlies everything that exists. Chit means consciousness, pure awareness, not the awareness of this or that object, not the awareness that belongs to this particular mind, but the awareness that is the ground of all knowing, the light in which everything that is known appears. The Upanishads say that consciousness is not a property of matter. It is the condition in which matter appears. Ananda means bliss, not pleasure in the ordinary sense, not the satisfaction of a desire or the enjoyment of an experience, but the intrinsic quality of pure being awareness itself, the fullness, the completeness, the wholeness of the ground of existence prior to any division, any lack, any separation. Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss. The ground of reality is existence, and that existence is conscious, and that consciousness is, at its root, whole. Now translate this into the language of modern physics. The quantum field, the fundamental description of physical reality that underlies quantum mechanics, is not a collection of particles. Particles are excitations of the field. They arise in it, propagate through it, and dissolve back into it. The field is primary, the particles are secondary, temporary, localized patterns in a more fundamental substrate. And that field, the quantum vacuum, the ground state of all quantum fields, is not empty. It is not nothing. It seethes with energy. Virtual particles flicker in and out of existence. The 0 point energy, the energy that remains even at absolute zero temperature, when all thermal motion has been removed, is non-zero and, according to some calculations, almost unimaginably large. The ground of physical reality is not empty space. It is a field, an active, energetic, creative ground from which all particles, all forces, all forms arise. This is Sat, pure being, the ground that simply is, from which all forms emerge. But the quantum field has another property that standard physics discusses with great discomfort. It is non-local. An experiment performed on one particle instantaneously affects its entangled partner, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and spent years trying to prove it was impossible. But the experiments confirmed it. The quantum field is, in some sense, that our ordinary spatial intuitions cannot fully grasp, undivided. The apparent separateness of particles in space is a feature of the surface, of the level of Maya, we might say, not of the underlying field itself. This is beginning to sound like Chit, like a ground that is, in some fundamental sense, unified, not divided into the separate, isolated objects that ordinary perception presents to us. And the physicist Erwin Schrödinger, whose equation describes the wave function, whose cat has become the most famous thought experiment in the history of science, wrote in his book, What is Life?, the following: the total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings. The total number of minds in the universe is one. Schrödinger was not speaking metaphorically. He was a rigorous mathematical physicist. He was reporting his conclusion about the implications of quantum mechanics for the nature of consciousness, and his conclusion, arrived at through the mathematics and the experiments of the most advanced physical science of his era, was the conclusion that the Upanishads had reached 3,000 years earlier through direct philosophical investigation and meditative inquiry. Consciousness is singular. The ground of being is one. The apparent multiplicity of minds, of observers, of individual conscious beings is, like the apparent multiplicity of particles in a quantum field, a feature of the surface, not of the depth. Brahman is not a belief. According to the most rigorous physics of the 20th century, it is a description of the structure of reality. Oppenheimer knew this. He had read Schrödinger. He had read the Upanishads. He understood that the two descriptions, The ancient and the modern were converging on the same truth from opposite directions. In 1954, 9 years after the bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer stood before a security hearing board and was stripped of his security clearance. The official reason was that he had opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon of even greater destructive power than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The real reason was more complicated. A combination of political persecution, Cold War paranoia, and the settling of old scores by powerful enemies. The hearing was a public humiliation. Oppenheimer, the man who had led the project that ended the Second World War, the man who had been called the father of the atomic bomb, was treated as a security risk. Former colleagues testified against him. Letters were read aloud. Private conversations were quoted. His judgment, his loyalty, his character, everything was put on trial. He did not fight back. He did not become bitter in public. He did not mount a campaign to reclaim his reputation. He retreated, and he returned to the Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita had something to say about exactly this. About action and its consequences. About doing what must be done and accepting what follows. About the difference between the self that acts, the individual ego, the personality that succeeds and fails and is praised and condemned, and the deeper self that witnesses, that remains unchanged beneath the surface of events, that is not touched by the outcomes of the actions performed in its name. Krishna's teaching to Arjuna is not simply about fighting or not fighting. It is about the nature of action itself, about what the Gita calls nishkama karma, action without attachment to results. The teaching that the wise person acts fully, with complete engagement, with the full force of their intelligence and skill and courage, but does not identify with the outcome, does not define themselves by success or failure, does not cling to the results of their action as the measure of their worth. You have a right to perform your prescribed duties, Krishna tells Arjuna, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your actions. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities, and never be attached to not doing your duty. Oppenheimer had done his duty. He had built the bomb. He had believed, with the full weight of his intelligence and his conscience, that it was necessary, that stopping Nazi Germany from developing nuclear weapons first was a moral obligation that outweighed the horror of what he was building. He had acted. He had acted with complete engagement and extraordinary competence. And then he had lived with the consequences, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the Cold War, with the arms race, with the world that his action had helped to create. And now, stripped of his clearance, excluded from the institutions he had served, he was being asked, by the logic of the Gita, by the philosophy he had absorbed over decades, to release his attachment to the outcome, to continue without the recognition, to find the ground beneath the surface of success and failure, praise and condemnation. He did not disappear. He continued to write, to lecture, to think. He gave the BBC Wreath Lectures in 1953. He wrote about the relationship between science and culture, about the responsibility of the scientist, about the nature of knowledge. He spoke about the Gita, about the ancient traditions, about the need for a wisdom that could match the power that modern science had placed in human hands. But the deeper significance of his return to the Gita in these final years is not biographical. It is philosophical. Because what the Gita was offering Oppenheimer in his exile was not consolation. It was a framework, a map of reality in which the individual, even a great individual, even a man who had changed the course of history, is not the ultimate actor, in which the forces that move through human beings, that find expression in human choices and human actions, are part of a pattern larger than any individual life, in which Brahman, the ground of being, the consciousness in which all of this arises, is not diminished by any particular outcome. The bomb had been built. The world had changed. Oppenheimer had been broken by the system he had served. And beneath all of it, beneath the fireball and the hearing room and the stripped clearance and the years of exile, Brahman remained, unchanged, undivided. The ground in which creation and destruction, honor and humiliation, the physicist and the bomb were all, at the deepest level, one thing. He had quoted that verse in the desert because he had recognized it, and he lived the rest of his life in its shadow, trying to understand what it asked of him. Oppenheimer was not alone. He was not an isolated eccentric who happened to develop an unusual interest in Sanskrit. He was part of a pattern that, once you see it, is impossible to ignore. The founders of quantum mechanics, almost without exception, turned to the ancient wisdom traditions of the East to understand the implications of what they had discovered, not as a curiosity, not as a hobby, but as a serious philosophical response to the crisis that their own science had created. Erwin Schrödinger, whose equation describes the wave function and whose thought experiments defined the philosophical puzzles of quantum mechanics, studied the Upanishads throughout his life. He wrote extensively about Vedanta, the philosophical tradition rooted in the Upanishads. He argued that the concept of the Atman, the individual self, being identical to Brahman, the universal ground, was the only philosophical framework adequate to the implications of quantum mechanics. He said explicitly that multiplicity of individual observers was an appearance, not a fundamental reality. That consciousness was one. Werner Heisenberg, who formulated the uncertainty principle and co-developed the matrix mechanics version of quantum theory, had a long conversation with the Indian physicist and Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore in 1929. Heisenberg later said that this conversation helped him understand his own physics, that Tagore's description of the Vedic concept of reality as a unified field of consciousness in which individual forms are temporary appearances resonated with the implications of the uncertainty principle in ways that Western philosophical frameworks did not. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, whose Copenhagen interpretation became the official position of mainstream quantum mechanics, chose as his coat of arms the Taoist symbol of yin and yang. He wrote, "For a parallel to the lesson of atomic theory, we must turn to those kinds of epistemological problems with which already thinkers like the Buddha and Lao Tzu have been confronted." David Bohm, one of the most original physicists of the 20th century, who developed a theoretical framework called the implicate order to describe the non-local, undivided nature of quantum reality, engaged in a long philosophical dialogue with Jiddu Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher who had been trained in the Vedic tradition. Their conversations, published in several books, represent one of the most serious attempts in the 20th century to bring the insights of modern physics and ancient Eastern wisdom into direct contact. Bohm's concept of the implicate order The idea that what we experience as separate objects in space and time are actually projections from a deeper, undivided reality that he called the hollow movement is, in structural terms, almost indistinguishable from the Vedic concept of Brahman manifesting as the world through Maya. And then there is the physicist who said it most directly. John Wheeler, who coined the term black hole, who worked with both Einstein and Bohr, who made foundational contributions to our understanding of quantum gravity, proposed late in his career what he called the participatory universe. The idea that the universe is not simply observed by consciousness, but in some fundamental sense brought into being by observation. That the act of measurement, the act of the observer interacting with reality, is not an add-on to physical reality, but constitutive of it. He drew a diagram of a universe shaped like the letter U, with the observer at one end looking back at the beginning of time, and the act of observation at the other end bringing the universe into definite existence. He called the universe a self-excited circuit, a system that brings itself into being through observation, the universe observing itself into existence. Consciousness as the ground of physical reality, the observer and the observed arising together from a single undivided field. This is quantum physics in the 21st century, and it is also the Bhagavad Gita. It is also the Upanishads. It is also what Oppenheimer had been reading in Sanskrit since his 20s. Long before the bomb, long before Los Alamos, long before the desert and the fireball, and the words that came into his mind in the moment that the world changed. He knew. He had been told in the ancient language what physics was going to find, and he spent his life at the intersection of the two. The most powerful destructive technology in human history, and the most profound description of the ground of being that human thought has ever produced. That intersection is not comfortable, but it is perhaps exactly where we need to be. Robert Oppenheimer died on February 18th, 1967. He was 62 years old. He had been diagnosed with throat cancer. A physicist who had chain smoked throughout his adult life, who had spent the war years under extraordinary stress, whose body bore the marks of everything he had carried. He died at his home in Princeton, New Jersey, in the same town where Einstein had spent his final years, in the same intellectual community that had been wrestling with the implications of quantum mechanics for 4 decades. He died still carrying the questions, still unresolved, still trying to understand what it meant. What all of it meant, the bomb, the science, the ancient text that had been in his mind in the desert on the morning of July 16th, 1945. In one of his last public statements, he said, "The physicist has known sin, and this is a knowledge which he cannot lose." The physicist has known sin. That is a strange statement from a man who had spent his career trying to place physics on a rigorous empirical foundation. Sin is not a term that belongs in the language of science. It is a moral and spiritual term, a term that implies awareness of a transgression against something sacred, against an order that exists beyond the preferences of the individual or the calculations of strategic advantage. What was the sin that Oppenheimer knew? Not simply the deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not simply the arms race or the Cold War. Those were consequences. The sin, if we take his words seriously, if we follow the Vedic framework, through which he understood his own life, was something more fundamental. It was the sin of forgetting Brahman, the sin of acting as though the physicist, the individual, the ego, the personality, with its ambitions and its loyalties and its calculations, was the ultimate actor. As though human intelligence, however brilliant, was the highest intelligence in the field. As though the power of matter could be wielded by the limited understanding of a person without reference to the wisdom that the ancient traditions described as the ground of being itself. The Bhagavad Gita does not say, do not act. It does not say, do not use your intelligence or your power. It says, act from Brahman, act from the ground, act from the understanding that you are not the ultimate actor, that the intelligence moving through you is larger than you, that the consequences of your action extend beyond what your individual mind can foresee, that the wisdom required to act rightly in a world of this complexity requires more than human cleverness. It requires what the Vedic tradition calls viveka, discernment, the ability to distinguish between the real and the apparent, between the ground and the surface, between Brahman and Maya, between the self that witnesses and the self that acts. Oppenheimer was one of the most intelligent human beings of the 20th century, and he spent his final years haunted by the recognition that intelligence alone is not enough, that the power to split the atom requires a wisdom that goes deeper than physics, a wisdom the ancient Indian tradition had been developing for 3,000 years. We are living in Oppenheimer's world. The weapons he built still exist. The technology his work enabled has transformed every aspect of human life. The power that modern science has placed in human hands continues to grow at a pace that leaves wisdom perpetually behind. And the question he spent his life asking, the question that the Gita was asking 3,000 years before Los Alamos, has never been more urgent. What is the ground of being? What is the field in which all of this arises? What does it ask of us? Oppenheimer quoted the Gita in the desert because he recognized something. He recognized the totality. He recognized that the force he had unleashed was a confrontation with the ground of being itself, with the level of reality where the boundary between creation and destruction dissolves, where the bomb and the desert and the man watching are all expressions of a single undivided field. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that recognition required. He did not find a final answer, but the question he was asking, the question that the ancient Indian tradition encoded in the text he loved, remains. And it is perhaps the most important question our civilization has ever faced. This is Sacred Flame TV. If this opens something in you, share it. Because some questions do not belong to one person. They never did. Music by Pavel Bikirov from Pixabay.